Here I sit, a major studio executive, watching the black sky of original ideas swirl above in the clouds. I know not up from down these days. I need a sign, something to add to the slate. They say that even a man who has money at heart and prays to the stock market at night can become a gross poor person when an original story blooms and the 5,000 Kelvin light is bright. I am fearful. Wait, that's it!
Even a man who is pure of heart and says his prayers by night may become a wolf when the wolf's bane blooms and the autumn moon is bright.
George Wagner's 1941 The WOLFMAN is perhaps the most important werewolf movie to ever release, which should make it no surprise at all that in the mid-2000s a remake for it was ordered, as that was kinda just what you did with any iconic horror IP at the time. Originally announced in March of 2006, the film went through 4 years of delays and production woes, with the original director Mark Romanek parting ways with production due to creative differences in the approach to the project from what the studio wanted. Romanek wanted to make something more than just a popcorn werewolf movie, and his ideas were not jiving with the studio, who was hesitant to put down the money for something that wasn't going to have as much mainstream appeal, and after searching through a few other directors, Joe Johnston was eventually settled on, with David Self coming along to rewrite the script that Romanek had been working on. Benicio Del Toro was attached to the project from the very beginning, being a massive fan of the original, so much so, in fact, that he had some memorabilia from it. Made for a cool $150 million, the film didn't manage to make back its production budget. Shocker upon its release in 2010. It's kind of crazy to hear how much money major studios were putting down for horror movies at the time, because we don't see anything even remotely close to that sort of budget for horror these days, even from the biggest releases. I think it also illustrates a lot of the flaws in the mindset of this sort of thing, where they were unwilling to take a chance on a presumably more ballsy and creative script, but figured that if they just threw a ludicrous sum of cash at the project and made it look fancy, it would do well. Now, I am probably coming across as quite harsh here, and there are reasons for that, because this movie has a lot of issues, but I do think it's important to note that as far as remakes of the classic properties go, this is not at the bottom of the barrel. It's not a beat-for-beat remake, and there were some new ideas that they wanted to explore here. Now, there are two versions of this movie. There's the theatrically released cut and the unrated director's cut, which introduced an additional 17 minutes of footage into the movie and is definitely the better version overall. I'll talk more about the differences between the two versions in a moment, but the movie feels marred in a lot of circumstances by the studio likely breathing over the shoulder of the production with a budget like this, and the things that were cut definitely emphasize what the focus was, because there are some very strange omissions in the theatrical version. It was just a messy production overall. Like, they started filming before the script was even finished, so they're kind of setting out for failure there. This movie's multiple delays were without a doubt a big reason that it didn't manage to make its money back. In 2006, when it was greenlit, these remakes were doing really well financially, but by the time it came out in 2010, interest had drifted away from amped up remakes of classic horror movies and was becoming more about the haunted house and demonic possession stuff, so they really just missed out on the wave. That doesn't mean the movie is all terrible though, so let's take a look at the 2010 remake of The WOLFMAN.
Whatever did it was big, had claws, and didn't mind a load of buckshot.
The opening scene of this movie sums up all of the things that I like about this remake and the things I really don't. It does make a good immediate impression with the visual style, showing an understanding of the sort of atmosphere that suits a story like this. The foggy moors and dark woods, the rolling countryside and aged stone manors. The movie looks fantastic in a vacuum. The style, it feels kind of confused because we have this really elegant and effective imagery that feels like it's sabotaged by the direction, where the camera movements are too amplified and digital to fit the setting. It also shows how this take on the Wolfman has no interest in playing with or even slightly leaning into the mystery element of the original, and is much more focused on just getting to the mayhem as quickly as possible. We open with Ben Talbot, a character who was mentioned in the original but we never actually met. He's the brother of our main character, Larry, and if you've seen the 1941 film, you know how this is going to go. The death of Ben Talbot is the thing that brings Larry back to his childhood home, and it's the same here. The issue is that while the original movie had an air of mystery around Ben's death, the remake opts to instead show us right off the bat that Larry was killed by a werewolf. Now, I'm not going to pretend that we didn't know going into the original who the culprit likely was, since the movie is called The Wolfman and the poster shows a wolfman, but it feels like they could have played into it more. In the 1941 version, it's entirely possible, because of the way that the story plays out, that Larry actually has a shaky grip on reality and is perhaps losing his mind. But by showing the Wolfman this early on, in a scene where Larry is not even in the region at the time, they completely wipe away any possibility of that mystery being a part of the story. Now, I don't always think that a remake should be so directly compared to the original, but in this case, the story, especially in the first half, is followed so closely. Because of that, I feel like comparing the remake to the source material can help illustrate why certain elements of the new take work or don't work by comparing them to the things that did or didn't in the original. Anyway, the big reason that I feel like that opening scene sums up the movie's strengths and weaknesses is because of how it embodies the sort of confused identity of the whole thing. We have this elegant production design that, while some of it is clearly digital, it's done well enough, especially for the time, that it doesn't bother me too much, but then the execution of it feels very cheap and conflicting with the setting and premise, and that's something that I felt throughout the entire thing. I think now's a good time to talk about the two different cuts, because the decisions made for the theatrical version do a very good job at illustrating what the priorities were. So the main reason that such substantial cuts were made was because the studio wanted to get to the werewolf transformation as quickly as possible, which to me is already a red flag. They were willing to cut out multiple scenes that are pretty important for properly setting up the story and the characters, the latter of which, even in the director's cut, still feel pretty anemic, so when there's more chopped, it feels even worse. Most of these cuts were from the first act, with things like Gwen traveling to find Larry during his stage play to tell him of Ben's disappearance, his train ride to Blackmore, his outburst at a local bar, as well as some sections of conversation that are completely cut. Max von Sydow's character is completely absent in the theatrical cut, which is such a strange decision considering this means we never learn how Larry got his silver cane, and it just makes it seem like some super lucky coincidence. Also, why the fuck would you cut Max von Sydow? Definitely go with the unrated version, it's a much better movie. And I will link a great website that lists all of the differences in the description if you're curious to see every single change that was made. I want to start by talking about how Larry's character is handled, because it took me a bit of time to realize why I wasn't feeling as invested in him this time around. His character in the original movie wasn't some super fleshed out and fascinating guy, but it was Lon Chaney Jr.'s performance that made him so endearing.
Yeah, go ahead. But don't try to make me believe that I killed a man when I know that I killed a wolf. Yes.
He's got this natural charisma and charm to him, and when he realizes the situation he's in, he played that fear of losing himself and hurting the people around him so well. It's a really effectively panicked performance.
I've still got the charm you gave me, remember?
Yeah, I know, but I'm afraid.
It's actually Lon Chaney Jr.'s performance that I think makes the original such a good film. And while I've definitely liked some of Benicio Del Toro's performances, he's just not good in this movie.
Hello, Doctor. I thought our appointment was until Friday.
He's completely flat and uninteresting, and it doesn't really feel like his character changes throughout the story, despite literally turning into a fucking werewolf. That lack of change is something that's present with basically everyone in the movie, which makes me wonder if the really bland performances is just down to the script that these actors were working with. It is hard not to love an Anthony Hopkins performance though. He can make a really bland script like this a little more tolerable. For a story that's literally about people shifting into monstrous beasts, the characters are so insanely stagnant, which feels like a pretty big missed opportunity. Gwen, for example, feels like an area where there would probably be more attention given, but she's about the most cookie-cutter love interest where she's grieving the death of Larry's brother, who was her husband, and she eventually falls in love with him. That's sort of it. I do like the change that they have her be the one who ultimately lands the killing blow on Larry, because it gives her more of a role in the narrative, but she just feels really superficial. This would have worked so much more if they had developed these characters and especially their relationship with more detail. It's not a dig against Emily Blunt, by the way, because I tend to really love her in movies. She's fantastic. Just not working with much here. The big change here is that Larry's father, Sir John Talbot, is now also a werewolf and is the one who actually killed Ben, as well as Larry's mother, and the one who passes the curse on to him. This is a change that I don't mind at all in theory, because John in the original movie didn't really have much to do. This opens up a lot of great emotional context for the movie to explore, where John could have been nervous about Larry returning because of what he did to Ben, and is grappling with the guilt of what happened, being responsible for the deaths of those around him who he cares about. But he's instead played like a damn near cartoonish villain. And I'm not being hyperbolic, by the way. The dude literally underscores his own villain speech at the end of the movie with dark classical music.
And I will say unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before thee. I am no more worthy to be called thy son.
If anyone can make that work, it is Anthony Hopkins. If I walked into an old manor and I saw Anthony Hopkins sitting in the corner playing dark music on a grand piano by candlelight, would I be willing to leave? I think I'd be willing to die in that scenario, because that's pretty fucking cool. The handling of Sir John's character, while there is more to him here than there was in the original, is just bizarre, and it feels like the writers had no interest in doing anything with him beyond making him an opposition to make Larry more of a clear hero for the story. It's strange. It's strange. I wish they could have done more. I wish they could have done more. It could have been so good. Could have been so good. I'm trying to take some script writing notes from this movie.
Terrible things, Lawrence. You've done terrible things. It is as you said, Inspector. It is as you said. Be strong, Lawrence. Be strong.
That's been bothering me for days. He seems to take great joy in passing the curse on to his son and never shows any genuine guilt or grief about the death of anyone he's hurt, which to me feels sort of against the entire idea behind the fear of being cursed by a werewolf. I don't mind the idea of someone who learned to accept the curse, and there's a cool backstory that's given where he had someone lock him up on every full moon and spent the years wallowing away in fear of what he was becoming, and eventually succumbed to the darkness inside of him, accepted the curse, and decided to let loose on full moons, knowing that he could never truly restrain from what his nature had become, embracing the very thing that led him to kill his own wife and traumatize his son. And that sounds like a way more interesting movie that would have been a far more effective remake of The Wolfman, because it's actually dealing with the psychological horror of this curse. The whole thing is revealed to us through one long expository monologue, and since the state that we meet Sir John in is the one that has fully gone mad and accepted the curse, the backstory never gets to actually meld into his character. We see absolutely nothing of the man described to us, to the point that it may as well be a totally unrelated character. The backstory described here is way cooler than the actual story we're experiencing, and if that's the case, it begs the question of why we're not being shown that part of it. Who is the villain in the original? Is it the doctors who grow to believe that Larry is losing his mind and needs to be institutionalized? Is it Bela for being the one who passes the curse on to Larry? Is it Larry himself? No, it's none of those. The villain in the original movie is the curse itself, and the way it makes people unable to recognize themselves and fear being around those they care about.
If I stay around here much longer, you can't tell who's gonna be next.
Which is a fantastic idea. The original Wolfman isn't about sitting down and watching a werewolf kill people. It's about watching Larry's tragic story as he goes from a gentle and kind man to a monster. It's his story at the end of the day. In the remake, the villain is Sir John Talbot. It's a much less interesting approach to this material, because instead of trying to expand on the emotional side of the original story and do something fresh with those ideas, this remake is perfectly content to just have a standard villain be the threat at the core of the story so that Larry can have a big fight in a burning building at the end of the movie. This climax literally feels like the only reason they decided to make Sir John a werewolf, because they don't really do anything with him beyond taunting Larry. To be fair though, as goofy as this is, watching Anthony Hopkins transform into a werewolf and have a fight to the death in a burning building, it's kind of like a bucket list sort of thing, so necessary evil maybe? I like that they gave more significance to his character, but this is about the most bone-dry way to do it. Again, it's not that I want this to be exactly like the original, but when the whole movie feels so uninspired, it just makes it feel really pointless. There's no mystery to get involved in because the opening scene kills any chance of that, so we spend a huge chunk of the movie just waiting around for the other characters to get caught up on information we've had since before we even met them. And that could have been more interesting if they had developed the characters while this was going on to give us something to chew on, but we just get a bunch of these horrible made-for-TV looking flashbacks that are just bland exposition for parts of Larry's backstory. Throw a couple big kill scenes in there and call it a day, and that's about all this movie has to offer for the first half. Is the second half better? In some ways, sure. but mostly because it's where they're telling a story different from the original, and so it doesn't feel like a cheapened retelling of something we've already seen. When Larry gets apprehended after his massacre on his first night as a werewolf, he's brought to an asylum where they use these experimental treatments on him. You know, the like 19th century kind where they just rip a chunk of your lung out to see if that might maybe cure your insomnia. We won't know if we never try. Thank our lucky stars though, because we get more shitty flashbacks and exposition dumps here. I know I seem pretty bitter right now, and I try to avoid being overly negative or bitter in my videos. It's something I don't like to do. I don't enjoy it. But after the 13th lame fucking jump scare and stupid overly digital expository flashback, a man can get a little cranky. I think that part of the reason that these things bother me so much is because the movie is still fun at times and the style can be really great. It's more frustrating for me than watching something that I just across the board don't like, because it feels like there are these solid elements that are really entertaining or well thought out that are being sidelined and sped past because the studio wanted to get to the next big massacre scene. And these scenes are fun, don't get me wrong. When you get to that first attack at the Roma settlement, it's pretty fucking sick in a sort of action horror way. It's amped up, fast-paced, and surprisingly gory, delivering on some solid carnage candy. The scene when Larry breaks out of his restraints in front of all these people who have gathered here to have his delusions demonstrated, only for them to see that he was actually completely right and then go apeshit on them before breaking free and wreaking havoc through the streets of London. It's awesome. That shot of him climbing up and howling at the full moon is one of the best of the whole movie, and the chase with the cops while shit's getting thrown over and destroyed and they're shooting at him as he tears through the populace and runs across rooftops. It's pretty hard not to be entertained by this sort of thing. This is much more of an action horror movie than it is a psychological or atmospheric one, and to be clear, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It just makes me question why this is a Wolfman remake. They could have just made a werewolf movie, but they likely decided to go with this to ride on the name of the original, and it's safe to say that most of the people who were going to go see this in the theater had probably never seen the original movie, so there wasn't too much pressure to try and carry on the things that actually made that story work. They got to use the famous name without needing to live up to it for the vast majority of the audience. To their credit, a lot of these issues come down to the fact that, you know, this movie changed hands a bunch of times and had so many delays, so by the time they actually got down to making the damn thing, there was some pressure on them to make it as quickly as possible, which is very likely where a lot of the sort of thin feeling comes from. And it's not hard to see why they'd opt to focus on the high octane scenes in that case and just play it safe. Joe Johnston was only brought onto the production 3 weeks before they started filming, which put a lot of pressure on him and limitations on how much he was able to develop things. Another result of this ties into one of the most important things about making a werewolf movie, that being the transformation from man to monster. An American Werewolf in London set the bar so insanely high for this that every single werewolf transformation is still compared to it 43 years later. And it's a shame to see that it was done almost entirely with CGI here. The design of the Wolfman itself is definitely one of my favorite things about this movie because it feels like a fantastic update to the original design that remains faithful to Jack Pierce's work while expanding on the ideas that he had. Rick Baker was the one behind the VFX here, and he did a great job. All of the practical effects in this movie are really, really good, but they're also all unfortunately marred by the very heavy digital look of the movie and the adjustments that were made in post, to the point that they never really feel fully practical. On top of that, while those action scenes are a lot of fun, I'm not sure I'm into the way they decided to handle the behavior of the Wolfman. It doesn't feel like a feral beast following its primal animalistic instincts. It's more like a hulking villain who is intentionally trying to cause as much damage as possible, throwing chairs at people and tossing them out of windows or reveling too long in a kill. I feel like there's still too much like vindictive humanity in the Wolfman here, and it makes it feel less like a bestial transformation and more like the Incredible Hulk took too many hair growth pills and had some serious roid rage going on. In terms of score, the situation here, also pretty weird. So Danny Elfman was the original composer for the film's music, but partway through the editing process of the movie, they decided that the score he delivered didn't really fit the vibe, and he was unable to take another crack at it because he was caught up in another project at the time. So Paul Haslinger was brought on to take over the soundtrack. Now you'd think that since they were unhappy with the previous score due to it not fitting, they'd give some pretty clear notes on the sort of thing they were looking for. But they either didn't do that, or Haslinger just decided to ignore them because he delivered an electronic score, which well, it seemed slightly out of place for a story taking place in the 19th century. After all that, Elfman's original score was used because they didn't have time to get another one done, and so the soundtrack that the movie has is one that the people who were making the movie thought didn't fit it properly, and I definitely felt that at times. The movie can be very tonally confused, and while I actually like the music that Elfman wrote, as I usually do with his soundtracks, it feels more whimsical and sort of like a dark fairy tale, which definitely doesn't fit well with the action-oriented telling of the Wolfman. It really stood out to me during the final scene, where it felt like the score and the tone of the scene were sort of fighting each other. Now, I've got one more thing to say. I know a lot of people really love this movie, because when I put a poll out, there were a bunch of people talking about it, and I get why it's fun. I can have fun with it too. I was entertained by some of this thing. But this movie pissed me the fuck off with its ending. I'm sure that for many, all they want is a fun, violent werewolf movie, and this delivers on that, and I've spent an entire video criticizing the characters and the story depth, which aren't really a huge worry if you just want some good werewolf carnage. Would you like to know why I'm so mad right now? Allow me to show you the final shot of the movie and the closing line that accompanies it.
It is said there is no sin in killing a beast, only in killing a man. But where does one begin and the other end?
No. Fuck you. You don't get to spend an entire movie shoving aside any of the psychological explorations of a werewolf story and putting all of your chips into the violence, and then at the very end pretend that this was actually meant to make you question the thin line between man and beast. Fuck off. I genuinely think that this final moment makes the movie worse for me than it would be if this was left out, because it feels like they're trying to take credit for some thought-provoking angle on the story that they were actively neglecting the entire time. Leave me alone.
Why would you do that, Lawrence?
The 2010 remake of The Wolfman definitely has its merits, with a solid, albeit sort of confused visual style and a handful of really fun and brutal action scenes, but the narrative itself feels so anemic and surface level and stagnant. Every time I watch this movie, I find it to be a slog to get through that offers nothing to keep me engaged beyond the action scenes that really only go so far. I'm not even really blaming anyone in particular for this, since it was such a rushed production after so many delays, which is super unfortunate because there's so much potential here for something a lot more memorable. And, you know, I do have it on Blu-ray, so it's not a movie that I like never want to watch again. I have a very weird relationship with this movie. It's far from being the worst remake, but it feels too safe and shallow to put it all that high on the list, at least for me. But I will watch it again, and I will enjoy it to a degree. Thanks for watching through to the end. I hope you enjoyed the video enough that you want to see more, and if that's the case, consider subscribing and hitting the notification bell because YouTube can sometimes suck at recommending channels. A huge thank you to my wonderful Patreon supporters and YouTube channel members who are a massive help in allowing me to continue committing as much time as I can to making these videos. If you want to gain access to things like behind the scenes material or gain early access to my videos, consider supporting me on either platform. As always, thank you for stopping by Rocklin Graves. I hope you've enjoyed your stay.